No matter how you slice it, things change, including reptile husbandry. And today we're going to go over the top 5 outdated reptile keeping practices that are still happening and need to stop. My name's Adam, this is Diamond, you're watching Wickens Wicked Reptiles, stick around. I think this list is going to be very much a chapping the behinds of people who haven't read a care guide in 10 years, and I really hope that's what we do. Let's change some minds, let's update some reptile husbandry, and if there's something that I forgot, let me know in the comments section, and while you're down there, hit like. Okay, let's start. Number 5, being afraid of proper substrate. And by proper, I mean in a lot of cases, loose substrate. Now, loose substrate isn't for every species and it's not for every age group. I think that babies, a lot of the times, especially bearded dragons and things like that, do better on a kind of like paper towel or newspaper or like something that isn't loose, just simply because babies are more susceptible to everything. They're more fragile. They're babies. But I want to get away from babies and talk about adults because your animal will be an adult for most of its life. So let's start there. If you have an adult bearded dragon, an adult leopard gecko, whatever, you can safely and easily house them on a proper loose substrate, something more naturalistic. And to clarify, I don't think there's anything wrong with using paper towel or newspaper or slate or anything like that. Personally, I don't. I wouldn't keep them on reptile carpet though. Those are like bacteria breeding grounds and you can get your claws snapped in them. Literally, there was blood everywhere one day when I used to use them. I learned my lesson, don't use reptile carpet, but you can use, like these kind of bland, boring type of substrates. They are easier to keep clean in certain instances, I guess, but also if they're soiled, the smell will be kind of brutal. They're a little bit messier to clean up than like something like what Diamond has here with a loose substrate. And let's just get to it. What I use for Diamond is a play sand and coconut core mixture. Super dry. If you grab a hold of it, and I will actually. So I'm literally taking it like in, ew, that's a piece of poop. I'm literally taking it in front of your face and I'll show you. This is what his substrate is. So I can grab a hold of this stuff and I'm trying to make a ball with it and I can't. So there's no way that this stuff is going to be impacted inside of Diamond, which is what the argument is, by the way. If you're kind of confused, and I should have mentioned that at the beginning, the idea is, and this was perpetuated in a lot of care guides, that a loose substrate will always lead to impaction. But there's no real study that we can find or can point to that shows this. I'm talking about legitimate study from the wild. Because the reason most of the time that you'll have an impacted lizard, or, well, I guess it's mostly lizards, right, is because their husbandry isn't proper. They're not getting the right basking temperatures, they're dehydrated. It could be a number of things that are causing the impaction in their gut. And we've even seen it before where impaction are things like just eating crickets or whatever their natural food item is that they can't pass because they're dehydrated, stuff like that. A healthy animal is not going to get impacted by a proper substrate like this. Oh yeah, and calcium sand is probably not great either because they will lick more of that than they would a natural substrate. So, and there is evidence that natural substrates like you'd find in the wild with bearded dragons, which isn't like a sandy desert, but there is sand and rocks and gravel. Sometimes it's kind of beneficial to have a little bit of that in their system because it has nutrients and minerals and things like that. So there's nothing wrong with loose substrate as long as you do it right. Let's move on. All right, while we're angering some people who are set in their ways, let's talk about small enclosures. I get so many comments about why do you keep ball pythons in 120-gallon enclosures? I've been keeping them for 15 years, which is the magic number. If you know something about ball pythons and want to show your argument, it's always 15 years. I don't know why. And I've been keeping them in these 10-gallon enclosures or these tub systems. And like, I'm not harping on tub systems. I understand that in order to have these animals at a price that is reasonable for people to buy and kind of keep them clean, I have no problem with tubs at all for those who are breeding. But if you buy an animal for a pet that you just want to give the best possible life to, give them a bigger enclosure. Because the myth is, if you're not familiar, that a big enclosure is going to stress them out and they're going to feel too much stress or they're going to stop eating and whatever other ridiculous nonsense that these people will say. And it's just not true. You can have as big of an enclosure as you want as long as the animal feels secure. So if you have a big enclosure and it has nothing in it, nowhere to hide, no cover, then yeah, your animal might feel stressed. But they'd feel stressed in a small enclosure if they had nowhere to go either. So it doesn't really matter. If you want a big enclosure, to do it right, have a lot of cover, a lot of foliage, things for them to hide behind, flipped over logs, whatever. Have some hides, one on the cool side, one on the warm side, or several for a big enclosure. Make sure the humidity is on point. Make sure they have lots of natural basking opportunities. There are so many things that you need to take in consideration regardless of the enclosure that you have and that you use, but especially with larger enclosures. And again, I would say that babies do better in smaller enclosures because it's easier to find the food, it's easier to find the water, and babies are just more fragile than adults. So this is kind of the same thing with a loose substrate. With babies, I keep mine on a, paper towel, and I keep them in tiny enclosures. Well, not tiny, but smaller than their adult counterparts. And then when I have adults, I give them as big of an enclosure as I can possibly muster. Diamond's in 120 gallon, my ball pythons are 120 gallons, my skinks are in 120 gallons, even Big Lou now has his own 120 gallon enclosure. And I think that you guys should be doing the same thing. But again, that's just my opinion, right? I personally am a big advocate of giving more space if you're able. Not only because it's better for the animal, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, but also it's just more fun to watch an animal roam around and not touching all sides of the enclosure. I just like this a lot better. And you guys are gonna love it because when that room across the hall opens, this room that I've been teasing, this much larger reptile room, about 4 times the size of this, I'm having some really big enclosures show up for some of the animals, so hit subscribe if you haven't already. You wouldn't want to miss it. It's actually ridiculously cool. Oh, and I know we'll get the comment, yes, it is a little bit more difficult sometimes to facilitate a larger enclosure than a small enclosure. I'm not saying it's not, but some things that are better take more effort. That's just how life works. All right, number 3, and kind of an obscure one you might not have thought of, albinos must be kept in the dark. No lights, no sunshine, nothing for albino animals because their eyes are super sensitive and they'll go blind. And then they're not gonna be able to, okay, give me a freaking break, dude. No, this is not a real thing. Of course, they are going to be more sensitive to light their eyes because they're lacking pigment. I have very blue eyes. Every time I go to the optometrist, they always tell me, make sure you wear sunglasses because you don't have enough pigment back there to really protect your eyes. And that does go to a certain extent with albino animals, but it doesn't mean that you have to keep them in pitch black. I would recommend that you give them the same lighting you'd give any of your other animals as long as they can get out of it. Like all of your other animals, you should be giving all of them the opportunity to either be in the light or be in a hide that is dark and cozy and secure. And my best example, I think, would be albino snakes, just because that's the B-roll I can show you to keep your attention here. Things like Pikachu or Thunder, who I put outside last week. I had her in the sun, and this isn't direct sun, by the way, so her eyes aren't like flaming balls in her head or anything like that. I think that it was completely fine and she shows no ill effects and she wasn't trying to run for cover. But people roasted me in the comments section of last week's video, which you can watch here, by the way, which is all about giant reptiles, which are awesome, saying that I am abusing this animal because this animal doesn't have the right protection of its eyes. And it's like, do you want me to have little sunglasses for Thunder? What exactly do you, that they go outside, right? They'll go outside during the daytime, even if they are albinos. And I mean outside of their hides. They don't have houses in the wild that I know of. It would be kind of cute though, with their tail and tapping nails. Okay, enough is enough. Let's get back to it. I think that albino animals should be treated like all your other animals. And by that I mean proper husbandry, places to hide, because all of the animals that I keep have places to go. So if you have sensitive eyes, just don't be in the sun. You have that option. And in this example, in the sun, I mean lights. And we're gonna get to lighting in a second, but let's move on to number 3 first, or 2. Where are we at in this list? Number 2, people who still move their animals to feed them, especially snakes. Now this, I don't think is actually wrong. It's just outdated and a waste of time and maybe gives undue stress, but I'm not even really a proponent of that. I just think personally, people who think that you need to move your snake to a different tub to feed it, because if you don't, then it's gonna think you're food every time you open the enclosure. Well, there's no basis of this. There's no study that can prove any of this at all. It's a baseless thing. It's just, I think, a common sense thing, because if we anthropomorphize these animals, which we do oftentimes, we would think, well, if I was in an enclosure and the only time it opened was for food, I would think every time it opens is... So I guess I get the thinking, but there's just no basis in it. Not only that, I just think it's a giant waste of time. I feed all of my animals, all of my snakes inside of their enclosures. If I'm taking them out to do videos or to take pictures or just to interact with them, whatever, I tap them with a hook. I make sure that they know that they're not getting fed. I bring them out of their enclosure. I'm very careful. Oftentimes, so cautious, people make fun of me, but I don't want to get a food bite from a snake. So that's just what I do. And I'm not going to be a silly goose here. I know that certain animals have very high food drives. I know that. My hognose snakes, this rack behind me where I've got these baby hognose snakes from last year, they all think they're getting fed all the time. It doesn't matter. And then I have things like ball pythons where I can take them out of their enclosure. I don't even really need to use a hook. They don't all think they're getting fed immediately. It just depends. And each one is different. I do have one ball python who is very gravid right now, so not interested in food. And she thinks during the course of the year, every time you open it up, she thinks there's food immediately, but most of them aren't. So every animal has a personality. And I think that maybe if you're one of these people who are dead set, you have to move your animals, maybe you just don't have any animals that aren't like the ones that you had to form your opinion. I'm so good at talking. This is so good. So this one actually isn't even that bad. Like, I don't think that anyone's harming their animal if they do this, really. I mean, maybe a little bit of stress, but not so much if you're just moving it real quick. I just think that, I don't know, it's just easier. It's less time consuming. I have a bunch of snakes, so it would take me forever to do this. It's just unnecessary. You don't need to move your animal to feed it. Period. All right, number one, and something that I was guilty of as recently as when this channel was on the air. No UVB and little enrichment. I was guilty of this. And I've told this story before where someone watched my videos, and I think I was like 1,000 subscribers or less at this time. And he said to me, he's like, hey man, have you ever thought about giving more enrichment? Most of your enclosures are kind of sterile. There's no like substrate. I was using like paper towel most of the time at this point. There's not really much for them to climb on. It's just kind of basic. And you're not giving UVB when you could. And I didn't realize how beneficial UVB could be. Now, I'm not going to be one of these guys that says everything with scales has to have UVB. You don't. If your ball python doesn't have UVB, no harm. It's going to live a completely healthy life. Even things like blue-tongued skinks, which I recommend wholeheartedly should have UVB, can live fine without it. I just think that there's certain animals, especially if they're diurnal, give them UVB. Even hognose snakes, which I tried, by the way. I had Nikki in an enclosure for a year that had UVB. It just made no difference. And I had Wickens in an enclosure with UVB last year to see if her eggs would be more calcified, because that's a thing with hognose snakes, is that sometimes their eggs don't calcify very much. And I think it did help a little bit. So this year I did the same sort of thing. I guess the argument, and something that I agree with now, which I used to protest, I even did a video about animals that don't need UVB. And although I kind of stand behind it, because the idea was people are going to take shortcuts, so at least guide them towards animals that won't die terrible deaths if you don't give them UVB. But in past, I think a lot of people have just been staunch and, like no room for changing their mind. And I'm not one of those guys. Someone told me that I should think about the fact that I might be wrong, and I changed my mind. Obviously, things like bearded dragons and Euromastics and things like that, they'll die terrible deaths. Like, you have to give them UVB. But even things like leopard geckos and stuff like that, and crested geckos, I give them UVB a lot of the time now. And because I just changed my mind so recently, I'm still observing myself, right? Because maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe, in fact, you don't need UVB and there's no benefit at all. I mean, there's lots of studies that kind of point to the direction of it's probably helping. And this one, again, I'm just saying that if you have an animal that needs UVB, like no ifs, ands, or buts, give it UVB, obviously. But consider giving other animals UVB as well. But more important than that even is enrichment, I think. I never used to have a lot of things for climbing and stuff like that, and even ball pythons. I've given some of my male ball pythons and even some females some like climbing opportunities, and they actually take them, which was surprising to me. I never thought that I'd see a ball python acting more like a boa constrictor, but they often do. So give them the opportunity, and I mean, what do you have to lose? If you throw in a branch, it costs you like $6. You have a branch in there that costs $6 that they don't use. Just give them the opportunity. I don't know. This, again, is just an opinion. This whole list is just my attempt to sway you to do better, based on people swaying me to do better. So there you go. That's it. Those are the top 5 outdated reptile keeping practices that I think we can improve upon as a group. What do you think? Let me know in the comment section below. I am not afraid of criticism. If you think I said something wrong, just let me know. I'd love to look into it more. That's how I get better at keeping reptiles, and I hope that most of you can also enjoy that. Being wrong sometimes and being better for your reptiles too. And as always, a special thank you to the Patreon supporters. You guys are absolutely amazing. I love the fact that we can kind of engage on this platform. You get videos early, you get extra videos. We're gonna put one out next week again. And you know about animals in my collection that I don't tell everybody else about. And discounts on the merch also. So if you wanna be a patron for as little as $1 a month, there's a link in the description, and I think I have run my mouth for long enough today. So, because I do videos twice a week, that means after you hit subscribe and like, I will see you on Thursday. Or Monday. What day is it?